electrical code prohibits the installation of isolated ground receptacles if a true isolated grounding system is not in place. The answer to your question is no. Isolated ground receptacles, characterized by an orange triangle marking, are specifically designed to minimize electrical noise and interference in sensitive electronic equipment. These receptacles establish a dedicated grounding path separate from the normal equipment grounding conductor. This separate path reduces the flow of common mode noise that can disrupt the performance of sensitive equipment. The purpose of an isolated ground is to provide a cleaner, less noisy ground reference for sensitive electronic devices. This is achieved by isolating the receptacle's grounding terminal from the metallic parts of the outlet box and the building's normal equipment grounding system. The isolated ground conductor then runs directly back to the grounding electrode system or a separately derived system without making contact with any intervening metallic enclosures or raceways. Simply using the color of an isolated ground receptacle to designate a UPS-powered outlet without properly implementing the isolated grounding system violates electrical code requirements. While the intention to visually differentiate UPS-backed receptacles is understandable, using isolated ground receptacles for this purpose alone is not permitted by code. The code mandates that if an isolated ground receptacle is installed, it must be wired as such with a dedicated isolated grounding conductor. Using the orange color coding of an isolated ground receptacle as a mere visual marker for UPS circuits creates a false representation of the system's grounding configuration. It could mislead electricians and other personnel into believing that the true isolated ground exists when it does not. This misrepresentation could lead to improper troubleshooting or modifications in the future, potentially compromising the safety and performance of the electrical system. There are compliant alternatives to identify receptacles connected to a UPS system. Firstly, you could use standard color-coded receptacles other than orange, which is reserved for isolated ground. Secondly, label the receptacles clearly with the designation UPS or UPS powered. Thirdly, you can create a panel schedule to indicate which receptacles are connected to the UPS system. Fourthly, you could employ a combination of labeling and panel schedule documentation for enhanced clarity. The NEC addresses isolated grounding in Article 250.96b. Article 250.96b discusses the bonding of metal raceways and equipment enclosures that contain isolated ground conductors. It's important to ensure that the isolated grounding conductor remains electrically isolated from the raceway or enclosure except at the point where it connects to the grounding electrode system. Article 406.3d covers the installation of receptacles, including isolated ground receptacles. This section details the requirements for grounding and mounting of receptacles to ensure proper electrical safety and performance. It is crucial to consult the specific requirements outlined in these articles of the NEC to ensure code compliance when installing and wiring isolated ground receptacles. Correctly implementing an isolated ground system involves careful planning and execution. The isolated ground conductor must be run separately from other grounding conductors and must not come into contact with any metallic surfaces along its path. The termination of the isolated ground conductor at the grounding electrode system or separately derived system must be done in accordance with code requirements to maintain the integrity of the isolated ground. When dealing with electrical installations, particularly those involving sensitive electronic equipment and UPS systems, adherence to the electrical code is paramount. Using components and wiring methods in accordance with their intended purpose ensures the safety and reliability of the electrical system and prevents potential hazards. Always consult with a qualified electrician or electrical engineer to ensure that electrical installations are performed in accordance with the latest edition of the electrical code and any applicable local amendments. In summary, avoid using isolated ground receptacles solely for identification purposes, especially in the absence of a true isolated grounding system. Opt for code-compliant methods such as labeling and color coding to clearly identify receptacles connected to a UPS system. The integrity of the grounding system is critical for the safety and performance of electrical equipment, and any deviation from code requirements could have serious consequences.